Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. We are continuing our series here on all of the spell changes in the Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook 2024. In this video, we're covering the 6th and 7th level spells. All of the spell levels prior to that, cantrips in 1st level, 2nd and 3rd, 4th and 5th, have all been done previously. They'll be available in a playlist down in the description, or available also on my channel page, of course, if you want to go back and watch those at some point. But before we get to that, if you are a new viewer to this channel or a returning viewer and you haven't quite hit that subscribe button yet, please consider hitting it now or at some point during this video if you like what you see. We're so close to that first 1,000 subscriber benchmark. That's very exciting. Again, I appreciate all of your support so much. But we're down to the final few spell levels here in Dungeons & Dragons. These videos won't be quite as long as the initial few because there's just fewer spells at these higher levels to go through. In retrospect, I probably could have done one video per spell level and they would have been maybe 20 minutes long like a normal video would. But once I submitted the first cantrips and 1st level spells, I was kind of committed to that format. I already have both of the presentations created for both 6th and 7th and 8th and 9th, so I'll probably be recording these back to back. I might change my shirt so it doesn't look like it, but all that aside, let's go ahead and start looking at our first 6th level spell. So starting off, we're looking at Arcane Gate. So there's not a big change here. It now just says that it opens in 2 large unoccupied spaces. So this is functionally the same, but it just uses different wording. Previously, the spell just said that you choose 2 points within range, one of which is within 10 feet of you. And then it later said in the description that the portals are 10 feet in diameter. So it'd still kind of occupy a large space in that way. But now instead of all that different wording, it now just says 2 large unoccupied spaces. And they've done a lot of that throughout the spell descriptions in the Player's Handbook, where they just kind of shortened everything because they realized they were kind of repeating the same information throughout the description of the spell. So instead they kind of condensed it. Moving on to Blade Barrier, it says that the wall now provides 3/4 cover from both directions, whereas it previously just said it provides 3/4 cover to creatures behind it, which kind of maybe implied that there was a front side and a back side, like there is to other wall spells, like the Wall of Fire only does damage on one side of it. But now that 3/4 cover goes both ways, as it should. The wall also now immediately does damage to creatures in its space when it's cast, whereas previously this was only when creatures started their turn in there. The wall does force damage now from slashing, and the wall also now does damage when a creature ends the turn in its space rather than starts its turn in their space. And we've seen that change a lot with spells that now do damage immediately when they're cast, as opposed to having to wait until that creature's turn to start doing damage. Moving on to Chain Lightning, the spell now specifies that the additional bolts arc to targets of the player's choice. I don't know that this was ever in contention, but maybe it was. Additionally, there were small changes to the material components where a bit of fur, a piece of amber glass, and a crystal rod were removed from the material components. For Circle of Death, this is unchanged. Conjure Fey, this is functionally a new spell in 2024, much like many of the other older conjure spells were. Again, pre-2024, conjure spells worked in such a way that they conjured, a number of smaller actual physical creatures. Conjure Fey now works similarly to sort of like a spiritual weapon type spell. Its one action has an initial range of 60 feet, so you can cast it up to 60 feet away initially. It has a duration of 10 minutes. So you summon a Fey spirit at a point within range, and you can make a melee spell attack against a creature within 5 feet of that spirit. It deals 3d12 plus your spell modifier and psychic damage. Additionally, it also imposes the frightened condition, and both you and the Fey spirit are considered the source of fear for the purposes of that frightened condition, which is pretty cool. And then much like a spiritual weapon sort of spell, you can repeat the attack as a bonus action on later turns after teleporting the spirit to a space within 30 feet of it and then repeating the attack against either the same creature or a different creature. And additionally, this spell also has upcasting for extra damage. It adds an additional 2d12 at each spell level above 6. So notably, I was comparing this to spiritual weapon, and a 6th level spiritual weapon does 5d8 plus your spell modifier on hit. It does only last 1 minute, but it also deals force damage, which is maybe slightly more reliable than psychic damage. So we can see that Conjure Fey just has less raw damage than a 6th level spiritual weapon if they're both cast at 6th level. But notably, of course, Conjure Fey does just automatically impose the frightened condition with no saving throw, and it can be moved further with each bonus action, whereas a spiritual weapon can be only moved 20 feet, whereas Conjure Fey is moved 30 feet. So, most base creature speed is at least 30 feet usually, so if a creature runs away from your spiritual weapon, they're probably not catching up to it ever again. However, when it comes to being upcast, Conjure Fey definitely pulls ahead. Moving on to Contingency, the school was changed to Abjuration from Evocation. So this is a nice addition for Abjuration wizards who can rebuff their arcane ward. This spell description also traded the word circumstance for trigger. So it says when a certain trigger occurs, you describe that trigger. It happens after that trigger occurs. This doesn't seem to have any mechanical impact. I tried to look around in the Player's Handbook and other places to see if they mention triggers as having a specific definition or being mechanically specific in some way. So I'm not quite sure why they're using this specific wording, and we'll actually see this again either in this video video or the next video. I can't remember which one, but there's another spell that also uses the word trigger. So it's clear that they did that for some reason, but it doesn't seem that there's any like specific definition that they're referring to in the rules. Additionally, the gem-encrusted statuette in the material component no longer needs to be made of ivory. For Create Undead, this now references the monster manual to find the stat block of the creatures, and it no longer puts the onus of having that stat block on the DM. So I've mentioned this with like Animate Dead, and I think there was another spell that I mentioned it for as well, that if you are going to be casting this spell as a player, it behooves you to have these stat blocks on hand, whether you request that from your DM, you know, when you're creating your character, or when you take the spell and say, hey, I have this spell now, I'm going to be casting it. If you don't have the player's handbook or the monster manual, you know, you can ask for that stat block from them, and you can have like a little sheet of paper or like a notebook that has all the summons that you can cast on it, just so you have that on hand so you don't need to look it up while you're playing. Additionally, it also says that if no command is given, the creature now only moves to avoid harm rather than defend themselves from hostile creatures. And again, this is another change that we've seen across summon type spells. Of course, if you've given them just a general command such as defend me from attackers and then you get incapacitated, that is still a standing command, and if you're being attacked, then they would attack the person who's attacking you. But if they're just sort of left to their own devices and aren't giving sort of a standing command, they will just, you know, try to stay out of the way of harm. Lastly, the clay pot filled with grave dirt and clay pot filled with brackish water were both removed from the material components. Moving on to Disintegrate, the only change here is in the material component. Now it says that any amount of dust is appropriate for the material component, whereas previously it was just a pinch of dust, you know, for whatever that would matter. Now we have Dromage's instant summons. The spell description now specifies that the sapphire used in the casting must also be touched at the time that the spell resolves. It is now a magic action to summon the object, whereas previously this was an action, no big surprises there. And notably, it no longer states that Dispel Magic on the sapphire can end the effect. I would imagine Dispel Magic would still work, although it doesn't specify that you target the sapphire, so I don't know if this means that you could either target the sapphire or the object that was marked for the summons, or if you would still technically just need to target the sapphire. So that'd probably be up to the DM. You know, you can let me know in the comments, you know, how you would rule it as the DM, if you can target either the sapphire or the object that was targeted for the summon. Moving on to Eye Bite, this is now a magic action to use the spell's ability on each subsequent turn. Previously this was an action, again, no big surprises there. The Sickened ability now applies the poisoned condition, whereas previously this gave the target disadvantage on ability checks and attack rolls, so it is effectively the same effect, but now it is specifically the poisoned condition. And additionally, it also no longer allows the creature to continue making saving throws against that condition. So this is a change that is heavily going to depend on the distribution of poison immunity within the new monster manual, so we'll have to wait and see what that looks like. But as it stands, this is kind of a nerf because it just doesn't apply to nearly as many creatures as it used to, because it wasn't specifically the poisoned condition. Moving on to Find the Path, it no longer states that the most direct path is also the shortest, but I think this is also just implied by the word direct. And also the material component no longer requires something from the location that you're seeking. So if you're familiar with the place but you don't have something from there, you can still find your way there. Moving on to Flesh to Stone. Even if the creature succeeds on the initial saving throw, their speed is still reduced to 0 until the end of the caster's next turn. Whereas previously, if they succeeded on the initial saving throw, just nothing happened. It was one of those sort of save or suck type of spells, as we call them. They also changed the wording a little bit, that it says constructs automatically succeed on the saving throw, whereas previously they said that the spell only works on creatures made of flesh. So there might be some situations here where creatures who are not technically made of flesh but aren't constructs could technically be affected by the spell, such as elementals or ghosts or just any non-construct creature that doesn't have flesh. And this is assuming that they're not otherwise immune to both the restrained and or petrified condition. It no longer states that a creature physically broken while petrified would suffer similar deformities when they're restored. This is also not covered by the rules for the petrified condition, though I think it is still very much within reason for a DM to rule it this way. Additionally, the text was changed to say that the condition must be ended by greater restoration or similar magic. And the keywords here is similar magic, which is implying that only magical effects can now end the condition. I mean, that's technically always true. I don't know that there are other non-magical ways to remove petrification. Although I know, like in Baldur's Gate 3, for example, they had basilisk oil. Arguably that could be magical in nature. But specifically, I just want to point out that the text here says that it has to be a similar magical source that would remove the petrified condition. And finally, the last small change here is that the material component was just changed to a cockatrice feather. Moving on to Forbiddance, this can now also affect aberrations. The damage of the spell can be dealt when a creature of the chosen type ends its turn in its space rather than begins its turn in its space. Additionally, the holy water and incense were removed from the material components. For Globe of Invulnerability, this is now a stationary emanation. There is no mechanical change. They're just using the emanation keywording. This now also no longer blocks spells of 5th level or lower if they were upcast beyond 5th level. So that is actually a pretty significant change because that rule wasn't there before. The rules around casting spells at a higher level still say that a lower level spell cast at a higher level takes on the higher level of that casting. So it says here that, a magic missile cast at level 2 is a level 2 magic missile. So if someone has Globe of Invulnerability and you cast magic missile at level 6, that is a 6th level spell, and that would go through the Globe of Invulnerability. So you are now sort of ironically more vulnerable in the Globe of Invulnerability than you were previously in 2014, which don't know how I feel about that, but that is the change as it's written. Additionally, the bead in the material component no longer needs to be crystal, and it no longer shatters when the spell ends, so you can keep that bead on you. Moving on to guards and wards, this is a pretty long spell, but there's only a few changes to go through here. It no longer explicitly states that you can guard several stories of a structure, although this should be covered by the contiguous clause because that can go upstairs and, around corners and up ramps and that sort of thing. Additionally, for the duration, the spell becomes permanent if it is cast in the same spot every day for 365 days. Previously, this just said 1 year. Additionally, the material components were slightly changed, where the burning incense, a small measure of brimstone and oil, knotted string, and a small amount of monster blood were removed from the material components. Moving on to harm, the max hit point reduction no longer has a duration, whereas previously this says 1 hour, nor can it be removed by any effects that removes disease, because of course they removed disease mechanics in 2024, so anything that removes disease would no longer exist to affect this spell. But it is worth noting that the long rest rules say that when you finish a long rest, your hit point maximum is restored to normal, provided of course that the effect that reduced your maximum hit points doesn't specify that that doesn't occur, which is not the case in this situation. For the heal spell, the school was changed to abjuration from evocation. Additionally, this now removes the poisoned condition from the target, whereas previously this said disease. But of course, like I've been saying, disease isn't a thing anymore in 2024 rules. And additionally, much like all the other healing spells we've been seeing, this now affects constructs and undead. For Hero's Feast, this now has a ranged of self with a 10-foot cube. The feast now appears on a surface within a 10-foot cube next to you. It grants resistance to poison damage, whereas previously this gave you immunity to both the poison damage and the poison condition. It no longer cures poison and disease, whereas previously this did that before. And perhaps most significantly, this no longer grants advantage on wisdom saving throws. I'm surprised that they nerfed this spell this hard. I know this was a very popular spell, and it's kind of one of those spells that if you're going into a big fight, if you have 6th level spells, you're looking for someone who has Hero's Feast and you're looking for the gold to get the component to cast Hero's Feast, and maybe they felt it was too ubiquitous that way and too strong to do that. But I think advantage on wisdom saving throws was one of the big reasons that you would want to cast this spell. I don't know now that they removed it that this is still a strong enough spell, because I mean, again, poison damage is very specific. You have to know that you're going into a fight that has a lot of poison damage. The frightened condition can come up, but again, that's pretty specific as well. You could increase your hit point maximum by 2d10, but of course an upcasting of the aid spell could do that almost just as well. Of course, Hero's Feast does affect more creatures, but overall I'm just kind of surprised by how much this spell has been nerfed. Moving on to Magic Jar. Again, this is a pretty complicated spell, but the actual changes here is that while possessing another creature, you gain their hit points, hit dice, strength, dexterity, constitution, speed, and senses, whereas previously you only retained your alignment and your mental stats, your intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. It also now specifies that the possessed creature's soul is incapacitated while it's in the jar. Returning to the container from the host body is now a magic action from an action. And for the material component, it used to say a gem, crystal, or reliquary, or some other ornamental container. So now it's just a gem, crystal, or reliquary worth 500 gold or more. Mass suggestion. The suggestion, much like the suggestion spell, is limited to 25 words from 1 or 2 sentences previously. The suggestion can't be something that would obviously deal damage, whereas previously this said obviously harmful. It no longer states that you can specify conditions that would trigger the activity, but I think this could still likely be assumed by the function of the spell. So this would have been something like, okay, the next time you meet a beggar, you would give them all your possessions. That sort of trigger is no longer explicitly mentioned in the spell, but I think that is still a reasonable suggestion that they felt that they didn't need to include it. Additionally, for the duration, if you cast this at 9th level, it now lasts for 366 days, whereas previously this said 1 year and a day. And the bit of honeycomb or the drop of sweet oil was removed from the material components. Remove earth. This is still the same spell, although the material component was just changed to a miniature shovel. Odaluk's freezing sphere, it now only freezes bodies of water, whereas previously this also included liquid that is mainly water. Being trapped inside the ice now imposes the restrained condition, whereas it didn't do anything like that before. The strength check to break free from being stuck in the ice now benefits from athletics proficiency. We're seeing a lot of those kinds of changes in anything that restrains, similar to like the web spell or similar spells. And additionally, the crystal sphere for the material component must now be miniature instead of small. Again, I don't know why they made such a weird change. For Otto's Irresistible Dance, this now requires a saving throw when you first cast the spell, whereas previously this affected the target immediately without a save. However, the target must still spend their movement on their next turn dancing in place, even if they succeed on the initial save. And finally, this now imposes the charm condition on a failed save, whereas previously this said that creatures who are immune to the charm condition are unaffected by the spell. So this is kind of the same thing, but I think at least one of the bard classes, I think it's the glamour bard, I believe, has some sort of synergy when they cast spells that have the charm condition, or if they cast a spell on a creature who is under the charm effect. So this can potentially now combo with things like that. So for Planar Ally, this only has one real change. So if you cast Planar Ally and you had the Planar Ally join your party for a part of an adventure, it previously said that the Planar Ally counts as part of your group when it comes to the purposes of splitting experience, but that text is no longer there, so that is no longer a thing that can happen. So if you cast Planar Ally and you have it join your group to help defeat an enemy, if you're using experience-based progression, the Planar Ally no longer soaks up part of that experience. For the programmed illusion spell, this now uses the word trigger instead of condition. So similar to the spell that I mentioned previously, this is now using the word trigger instead of the word condition, whereas I think the previous spell used the word circumstance. But again, I don't believe this has any specific mechanical impact. I wasn't able to find any specific definition of the word trigger. And of course, like many illusion spells, investigating the illusion is now a study action from just an action. And the bit of fleece was removed from the material components. So it's just a jade dust worth 25 gold or more. For Summon Fiend, the base text of this spell is mostly unchanged. This was added to the player's handbook from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, although there are some small changes within the stat block of the Fiendish Spirit. So to begin with, the death throes of the demon form. This is now an instantaneous emanation. There's no mechanical impact, it is just using the emanation keywording. Secondly, the fiery strike from the devil form now has a melee or ranged attack roll, whereas previously this was just a ranged attack roll. Additionally, that same strike no longer ignites objects that are being worn or carried. It just does fire damage. It doesn't set anything on fire. And then lastly, the blood no longer needs to be humanoid, nor does the vial need to be made of ruby. As far as the material component goes, it is just a bloody vial worth 600 or more gold. We have a new spell here in Tasha's Bubbling Cauldron. You might have heard of this one already. I know I've probably mentioned it in a couple other videos. So this is a new spell in 2024. It is one action with a 5-foot range. It has a 10-minute duration, no concentration, a conjuration spell, and has verbal, somatic, and material components. The material component is a gilded ladle worth 500 or more gold. What this does is it creates a cauldron filled with a liquid that duplicates the effects of one common or uncommon potion of your choice. You choose it when you cast the spell, of course. You or an ally can use a bonus action to retrieve a vial of liquid from that cauldron, and this cauldron can create a number of potions equal to your spellcasting ability modifiers. So because this is also a new spell, I wanted to include all the potential potions that you could get based on all of the expanded rules, not just the 2024 rules. So we're going to go through that real quick. For common potions, we have the potion of climbing. You gain a climb speed equal to your speed for 1 hour, and you have advantage on strength athletics checks to climb. There's also the potion of comprehension. This gives you the effect of comprehend languages for 1 hour. There's the potion of watchful rest, which is specifically from Waterdeep Dungeon of the Mad Mage. So if your DM is not including adventure specific potions in your particular campaign or whatever you're doing, you might want to run this by them if you're trying to choose this one, if you're able to choose this one. I think this one is a pretty cool effect where it says for the next 8 hours, magic can't put you to sleep and you can remain awake during a long rest and still gain its benefits. And the last available common potion at the time of this recording is just the generic potion of healing, where you regain 2d4 plus 2 hit points. Starting with our uncommon potions now, we start with the Blood of the Lycanthrope Antidote. This is from the Infernal Machine Rebuild adventure. This, unsurprisingly, just removes the curse of lycanthropy. Secondly, we have Bottled Breath. This is from the Princes of the Apocalypse adventure. It says when you inhale this air, you can either exhale it or hold it. If you exhale the air, then you gain the effect of the Gust of Wind spell. If you choose to hold the air in your mouth, you don't need to breathe for up to 1 hour as long as you're holding your breath with that air inside. We also have the Mummy Rot Antidote. This is also from the Infernal Machine Rebuild adventure. This, of course, unsurprisingly cures you of mummy rot. There's the Oil of Slipperiness. So this isn't so much a potion that you drink, it is something that you cover someone in. The oil can cover one medium or smaller creature over the course of 10 minutes. So it takes 10 minutes to oil someone up. When a creature is covered this way, they gain the benefits of the Freedom of Movement spell for 8 hours, which is pretty significant. The oil can also be poured out as a magic action, covering a 10-foot square, duplicating the effects of a grease spell in that area for 8 hours. I think this is actually a pretty good contender for one of the potions that you'd want to summon with Tasha's Bubbling Cauldron. Freedom of Movement is just a very powerful spell to be able to apply apply to all of your party for the cost of just one spell slot. Freedom of movement does upcast now for additional targets, and it's a 4th level spell, so at 6th level it would target up to 3 targets. But if you have a +5 to your spellcasting modifier, then you can affect up to 5 targets in your party, and that's basically like casting an 8th level freedom of movement, only using your 6th level spell slot to do it. And it lasts 8 hours as opposed to the 1 hour, I believe, of the regular freedom of movement. Moving on, we have the filter of love. The creature who drinks this potion is charmed by 1 hour by the next creature that they see within the next 10 minutes. Moving on to the Potion of Advantage. This is from the Wild Beyond the Witchlight adventure. You gain advantage on 1 d20 test of your choice within the next hour. There's also the Potion of Animal Friendship. When you drink this potion, you can cast Animal Friendship at level 3 with a save DC of 13. There's also the Potion of Hill Giant Strength, which causes your strength score to become 21 for 1 hour if it is less than that. The Potion of Growth grants you the Enlarge effect of Enlarge Reduce for 10 minutes without any concentration. The Potion of Poison is a potion that looks and smells and tastes like a potion of healing or other similar beneficial potion, but it's masked by some kind of illusion. If the Identify spell is cast on this potion, then its true nature is revealed. A creature who drinks this potion immediately takes 46 poison damage and must make a DC 13 Constitution saving throw or be poisoned for 1 hour. There's also the Potion of Polychromy, which is from Descent into the Lost Caverns of Sokan. It says you and everything you're wearing or carrying take on a rainbow hue for the next hour. You can use a bonus action to turn any color or a combination of colors. And if you choose colors that mimic the colors of your surroundings, it gives you advantage on dexterity stealth checks for the duration. We have the Potion of Psionic Fortitude. This is from Fandelver and Below the Shattered Obelisk. You have advantage on saving throws to avoid or end the charmed or stunned condition for 1 hour. So that could be pretty helpful if you're going into like a Mind Flayer colony. The Potion of Pugilism grants your unarmed strikes the ability to deal an extra 1d6 force damage on hit for 10 minutes. The Potion of Resistance gives you resistance to 1 damage type for 1 hour. The DM either chooses which type of resistance it has, or they determine it randomly based on the table in the description of this potion. You can certainly ask your DM if you can choose the resistance of that potion, in which case this is a very powerful spell if you know you're going into a certain encounter or a certain kind of damage is going to be prominent. There's also the Potion of Water Breathing that allows you to breathe underwater for 24 hours. There's the Greater Potion of Healing, which heals 44 plus 4 hit points, and again you could possibly get 5 of those from one casting of this spell. And then finally there's the Thessal Toxin Antidote, which is also from the Infernal Machine rebuild, and this ends the polymorph effect of the Thessal Toxin. Again, if you're not doing that adventure, you're probably not going to run into that specific toxin, so it's probably not worth using for the spell. Moving on from that one, we have Transport via Plants. This spell is unchanged. For True Seeing, this no longer states that you can see secret doors hidden by magic, but I think it's likely that one of the effects of True Sight would still allow this to happen. It no longer states you can see into the ethereal plane, but this is also covered by the rules of True Sight. And additionally, the material component no longer states that it is an ointment for the eyes, and it no longer includes saffron or fat. Wall of Ice, it now specifically says that you get to choose which side of the wall creatures in the area get pushed to when you cast it, whereas previously I don't think that was specifically mentioned, so some people might have ruled it that the creature decides which side that it gets to go to. The wall now has immunity to cold, poison, and psychic damage, so that's pretty cool. It's a little harder to destroy. And finally, the piece of quartz for the material component no longer needs to be small. It can just be any piece of quartz. For Wall of Thorns, it only has one change here where creatures can only make the save once per turn, whereas previously this was unlimited. Wind Walk has a number of changes here, so you no longer need to see the creatures you affect with the spell when you cast it. This now provides hover and immunity to the prone condition. It grants resistance to all bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage from only non-magical damage. The actions to transform into or out of the cloud form is now a magic action. Transforming causes the stunned condition from incapacitated, and the material component was changed to a candle. And then for our last 6th level spell, we have Word of Recall. This now no longer requires that you set a location at an area that is dedicated to your deity. I don't think there's even sort of an impetus here on this spell that the location that you set the sanctuary at must be like a holy place of any kind. I would assume that it just needs to be a safe space. I don't know that sanctuary necessarily has a hard definition. It does say such as a temple, but that is just one example. I think you could reasonably make any safe space a sanctuary, but your DM might rule differently. So moving on to our first 7th level spell, we have Conjure Celestial. So much like many of the other Conjure spells, this is functionally a new spell in 2024. It no longer summons a Celestial with CR 4 or less. This is one action, a 10-foot radius, 40-foot high cylinder within 90 feet. The duration is 10 minutes with concentration. Creatures in the area can be healed for 40-12 plus your spell modifier, or you can cause creatures in the area to make a dexterity saving throw or take 60-12 radiant damage or save for half. When you upcast this spell, you either heal more or you deal more damage. Bright light fills the cylinder and you can move it up to 30 feet when you move on your turn. And a creature is affected by the cylinder either when the cylinder enters its space, when a creature moves into that space, or ends its turn in that space. And this can only happen once per turn. So this is actually kind of a crazy spell for both healing and dealing damage. The 10-foot radius isn't quite huge, but I think there's something with these kind of spells because this is similar to Moonbeam and I think Conjure Animals or Conjure Woodland Beings. I think it's Conjure Animals. I think that's the other one that says like when you move, you can also move it, and then Moonbeam, you can just move it as well. Before 2024, these spells, or spells like this, like Moonbeam specifically, that has that old wording, whereas this is a functionally new spell, they didn't deal damage when they moved into a creature's space. They always dealt damage at the start of that creature's turn. So we never really had to worry about whether or not that spell continued to exist when you moved it, because it just says you move it to a space within 30 feet. It doesn't necessarily say that you cause it to reappear in a space within 30 feet or anything like that. It specifically says that it moves to a space within 30 feet. But now that this can deal damage when it enters a creature's space, we have to consider whether or not the effect of the spell continues to exist while it is moving. For example, the Conjure Celestial here, when you move, you can move the cylinder up to 30 feet. So I would assume that's in a straight line. I don't think you can make it like curve around or do any tricks or anything like that. But if you move it 30 feet in a line, does that effectively create a 30-foot long, 10-foot wide line across the battlefield where you can heal any allies in that area and deal damage to any enemies in that area when you move? If so, that's nuts. And this is basically like a sunbeam in that way that can also heal your allies. I feel like a lot of our knee-jerk reactions is going to be like, heck no, that's way too strong. But again, that's just something that we never needed to consider originally because the spells like this didn't deal damage when they entered a creature's space. They just dealt damage at the start of their turn. So that is something that is maybe going to come up at your tables, or you might bring that up with your DM to just double check how do spells like this work in your opinion, just so that you know what to expect when you cast a spell like this or Moonbeam or anything like that. I would be interested to play with it and see how that feels. Again, I understand that it is potentially very strong, especially if a clever party who on their turn can use their movement to move in such a way that they pass through the beam and get the healing, and then on your turn they can be lined up in such a way that when you move, you can cross all of your allies' positions and heal them again. So they're basically healing for 8d12 plus twice your spellcasting modifier per round, which is, again, a lot. And again, maybe that's too strong. It probably is, but I think I'd want to play with it just to really get a sense of how that feels. And again, if I was allowing it to work that way, if I'm the DM that's being used against my monsters, then that means I can just, increase the difficulty of certain encounters, knowing that they're going to be pushing out a lot of damage and healing with this spell. Moving on then to Delayed Blast Fireball. Much like the regular Fireball, this no longer goes around corners. The text was slightly changed where it says the damage increases when your turn ends and the spell hasn't ended, whereas previously this said at the end of your turn and the bead hasn't detonated. I don't believe there's any mechanical difference, they just changed the wording. Objects that aren't being worn or carried now suffer the burning hazard rather than just being sort of generically ignited. There are specific mechanics for burning. And then for the material component, the ball of guano and sulfur no longer needs to be small. So you can have the biggest ball of, bat poop that you want to use when you cast Delayed Blast Fireball. For the Divine Word spell, the spell is unchanged. Etherealness was changed to Conjuration from Transmutation. It no longer states that it can be dismissed as an action, but as I've mentioned in pretty much all of my previous videos, spell duration rules in 2024 specifically state that you can dismiss the ongoing effects of any spell that you cast action-free. So even though they removed that text from the spell, you can still do that without using any sort of action. For Finger of Death, this now no longer states that the zombie is permanently under your control, but this may be implicit because it still follows your orders. The lack of permanent control may also allow another necromancer to try to assert control over your zombie by casting an animate dead spell over it. For the Firestorm spell, the cubes must be contiguous, whereas previously this said they must have at least one adjacent face to another cube. This is arguably the same, depending on your DM's definition of contiguous. This might also allow for diagonal placement, where you could place cubes diagonally to each other, where their faces aren't touching, but their corners are. This also applies the burning hazard to objects that aren't being worn or carried, and it no longer specifies that you can choose not to burn plant life in the area. So if you drop this in like a forest, you're going to start the forest on fire. For Force Cage, this now requires concentration. That is a not insignificant fall from grace there, although most of the spell is otherwise unchanged. And additionally, the Ruby Dust, worth 1,500 gold or more, the material component for the spell is now consumed when you cast the spell as well. So not only is it concentration, but the expensive spell component is also consumed. So if you're in a safe space when you cast this, you can still use this to really warp the difficulty of an encounter, but it's just going to cost you a lot to do so. For Mirage Arcane, it no longer states that the terrain's general shape remains the same. This like you couldn't make a flatland look like a mountain or a crater or anything like that. Supposedly, you could still do that, although if you do that, of course, then it would just be that much easier to discern that they're in an illusion because things aren't going to match up. Or a DM might rule because this is a flat plane. That's what that sort of gray square means in the range/area, where it says 1 mile with that gray square. That is a two-dimensional shape. It is not a cube. So it may still need to cover the general shape of the terrain, since it's basically just like a thin layer of illusion on top of the flat plane within a 1 mile square. For Mordenkainen's Magnificent Mansion, the spell now explicitly states that opening and closing the door is action-free, whereas previously I believe this was an action to do so. The door is imperceptible while it's closed, whereas previously this was invisible. I know this is something that happened during the campaign 2, the Mighty Nine for Critical Role, where this is what Caleb used to create the mansion that they lived in, and I know this got dispelled because the big bad evil guy could see the door because they could see invisible things, so they were able to dispel it. For creating the floor plan, it does say that the 10-foot cubes on the floor plan must be contiguous, whereas previously this wasn't explicitly stated. The servants in the mansion are now considered invulnerable, and the material component was changed to a miniature door worth 15 gold. Moving on to another of Mordenkainen's spells, we have Mordenkainen's Sword. The initial range is increased to 90 feet from 60 feet. The spell damage was increased to 4d12 plus your spell modifier from 3d10. The sword can be moved up to 30 feet as a bonus action from 20 feet, and the miniature sword and the material component no longer has specific materials that it should be made from. For the plane shift spell, you can no longer banish unwilling creatures to another plane. I'm pretty sad about this one because I thought that was one of the cooler effects of the spell. This makes this spell just feel a little bit more like a plot device to get you from one location to the other. For Power Word Fortify, this is a new spell in 2024. It is one action with a 60-foot range. Enchantment spell, instantaneous duration, and a verbal component only. You can distribute 120 temporary hit points to up to 6 creatures within range. So you can divide that as you choose among any creatures, or you can just dump 120 temporary hit points on one creature. If you were to combine this with something like a very highly upcast Armor of Agate that still had its duration ongoing, but it was low on temporary hit points, and you drop a Powered Fortify for 120 temporary hit points, they'll keep that Armor of Agate for a very long time until the duration ends or until those temporary hit points go away. For Prismatic Spray, there's been a few changes, but it's mostly the same. The damage for the red, orange, yellow, green, and blue beams was increased to 12d6 from 10d6. The indigo beam no longer states that the target turns to stone, but that effect is covered by the petrified condition. But the petrified condition does say that you can kind of choose what material that they turn into, so it doesn't need to be stone. And then the violet beam no longer suggests that creatures not on their home plane are banished to their home plane and that others are banished to the astral sea. It is just teleported to another plane of existence of the DM's choice. For Project Image, moving the image is now a magic action from an action. You can move the image up to 60 feet per magic action, whereas previously this was just twice your speed. You no longer need to choose between hearing and seeing through the image or hearing through your own senses. And while the spell is ongoing, you are not blind and deaf to your own senses while you're able to hear and see through them this way, so you kind of have double vision, being able to see and hear both. It's a study action to investigate the illusion from an action, again, very similar among all other illusion spells. And the material component was changed to a statuette of yourself, although the cost of the spell is the same. For the Regenerate spell, it no longer instantly retaches severed limbs that are held up to the stump of where they were, and the holy water was removed from the material components. For the Resurrection spell, creatures can no longer have been undead when it died from not being able to work on undead creatures. Again, this is a very common wording change that we're seeing across all Resurrection spells. And much like other Resurrection spells, it no longer states that the soul must be free and willing, but this is covered in the rules about death. And again, I have a whole video about how the death rules work in the 2024 rules, so I'll probably link that down in the description again, link it up in the cards here, and you can watch it after this video if you'd like, if you're interested in that sort of thing. This no longer cures non-magical diseases, as disease mechanics were removed in 2024. The language about attack rolls, ability checks, and saving throws was replaced with D20 tests. And finally, the part that says casting the spell to revive a creature that's been dead 365 days or longer was changed to 365 days, whereas previously this said 1 year. Again, very similar to the effects of spells that we've seen that previously lasted 1 year. For Reverse Gravity, creatures at the top of the cylinder now just hover from Oscillate. So Oscillate sort of has a connotation that they're kind of turning around in a circle, whereas now they just kind of hover in place. There's no implied movement there. The spell states when the spell ends, affected things fall, whereas previously it said at the end of the duration. I don't believe there's any mechanical difference there, but there are some small wording changes if that would matter. For the sequester spell, affected creatures can't be detected by magic or viewed remotely with magic, whereas previously this said through scrying sensors created by divination spells. So this now affects a greater breadth of things. Creatures affected by this spell have the unconscious condition, whereas that wasn't present before. And lastly, the affected creature doesn't need food, water, or air for the duration, whereas previously the spell didn't mention that. So if your DM was being really strict about the starvation or dehydration rules, or even suffocation rules when you cast this spell, then that would technically be the effect that happens. For the Simulacrum spell, this is maybe one of the more controversial spells that have ever existed in 5e at least. So it has a number of changes, and basically they didn't really nerf the spell. If anything, they made it worse, but we'll talk about that in a second. So the changes here is that the spell finishes casting by touching the creature and a pile of snow of the same size as that creature. Originally, the snow was part of the material components, but it was removed from the material components and is now part of the description of the spell. The Simulacrum can't cast Simulacrum, which is their attempt to make it so that you can't create infinite simulacrums, but it doesn't quite work that way, and we'll talk about that in a second. The Simulacrum now has the friendly keywording, which means that you and designated allies have advantage on the influence action with your Simulacrum. It also states that Simulacrums can't take a short or long rest, whereas previously they were just unable to regain spell slot. The spell now states that the only way to restore hit points to your Simulacrum is to repair it during a long rest by spending 100 gold per hit point missing, and the Simulacrum must also remain within 5 feet of you during the time of that repair. It doesn't say how long the repair takes. Presumably it's during the whole long rest, but that is one change that is the only way you can affect it. Notably, a lot of the healing spells now do affect constructs, but we see that the text of the spell says that the only way to restore hit points to the Simulacrum is through spending the 100 gold per hit point to do so. And finally, the material component was changed to only 1,500 gold worth of powdered ruby, whereas we previously had the snow mentioned in there as well. So how does this spell compare to 2014 versus 2024? Like, in what ways is it still broken? In what ways did they kind of fix it, but not really? So the fact that Simulacrum can't cast Simulacrum doesn't really do anything, because that's not really how people were abusing it. The Simulacrum can still potentially cast Wish once you have access to Wish. So if you create Simulacrum of yourself using the spell Simulacrum, you create a Simulacrum without their 7th level spell slot, but they do have their 9th level spell slot for Wish. So then they can use the Wish spell to duplicate the effects of Simulacrum, because Wish says that it duplicates the effects of a spell of 8th level or lower. It doesn't cast that spell of 8th level or lower. So it rules as written is still able to duplicate the effects of Simulacrum even though they can't cast that spell. Again, it's maybe not in the spirit of the rules of this spell, but it is technically within the rules of this spell. The fact that you can only restore hit points by spending 100 gold per hit point to do so, I understand that's maybe one way they wanted to nerf the spell, that it's just eventually going to die unless you spend a lot of gold to keep it going. But it'd be very inefficient to even do that, especially considering that they can't really get their resources back. It would be more gold efficient to just create a new Simulacrum and have your old one destroyed automatically. So I think that's just kind of a weird change. Notably, the inability to take a short or long rest is pretty significant, because it prevents Simulacrums from regaining their class features or other features that come back in a short or long rest, not just spell slots. A popular sort of theoretical example was a divination wizard being able to get their portents back. So if a divination wizard has infinite Simulacrums with infinite portents, they can effectively control every role in the game. Not that that's ever happened or ever should happen, because at that point you should just sit in the DM seat and become the DM. And even then you should just write a book, because again, you determine every outcome. But now that the Simulacrums can no longer take a short or long rest, they can't get those features back. However, it does only say that the Simulacrums can't take a short or long rest, not that they can't benefit from them or gain the benefits of a short or long rest. So spells like the Catnap spell or the new Prayer of Healing spell that grant the affected creature the benefits of a short rest. So if the Simulacrum has any features that come back on a short rest, it would get those back. Notably, those spells specify that the creature can't gain that benefit again until they finish a long rest. And since the Simulacrum can't take a long rest, it can only benefit from those spells once each. And fortunately, there's no effect in the game that I'm aware of that allows a creature to gain the benefits of a long rest, similar to the Potion of Angelic Reprieve in Baldur's Gate 3. There's nothing like that within the game of Dungeons & Dragons, to my knowledge. So there's no way for the Simulacrum to gain the benefits and sort of cheat a long rest in that way, unless you have your most recent Simulacrum with their Wish spell. Instead of casting Wish to create another Simulacrum of you, you just instead had them wish to have you and all your Simulacrums gain the benefit of a long rest. That could technically work, although that specifically, when you use Wish that way, is within the purview of the DM. So if that would be allowed to happen, that is entirely the DM's responsibility to either let that happen or create specific restrictions about how that happens, or in whatever way that could happen, it is on the DM to make that decision as to whether or not that actually works. So it is technically possible that it could happen, but the DM would specifically have to allow it, and they're probably not going to allow it, because at that point you're really just abusing the spell. Moving on to Symbol. Symbol is a very large spell, so we're going to do some call outs here. So to begin with, it is now a Wisdom Perception check to spot the symbol, whereas previously this was Intelligence Investigation. The saving throw for this spell can now only happen once per turn, whereas previously this was technically unlimited. This spell also had additional effects called Hopelessness and Insanity. These features were just straight up removed from the spell. And then lastly, the material component of the Mercury and Phosphorus was removed. For the teleport spell, much like the symbol spell, it's just a very big wall of text. So again, we're going to do some callouts. The last sentence of these first two paragraphs basically just tells the player that the remaining 3/4 to 2/3 of this spell description is specifically for the DM. They're the ones who consult the table. They're the ones who consult the explanations of the table. The associated object category was renamed to linked object. There's no mechanical difference here. The viewed once and described categories were combined into one result because they had the same numbers, the same probability regardless. The spell now states that you appear in the closest similar place if you end in a similar area. Previously, this was a suggestion that you could appear in the closest similar place, but you might also appear in a place that looks very similar to it, but is much further away. But now it is a hard rule that is the closest similar space. If you are off target, the distance is now 2d12 miles away, whereas previously this was a more complicated calculation. The directions assigned to the d8 when you are off target were reassigned to different numbers, but they're still the same directions. And then if you are on target, it now says that you appear where you intended to, whereas previously it said you appear where you want to. So this kind of, to me, at least has the implication that the players need to decide where they want to end up before they end up there, whereas previously that may have not been the case, depending on the DM's adjudication of it. So that is all these changes to 6th and 7th level spells in 2024. Let me know down in the comments what you think about any or all of these spells, or as many as you feel like talking about down in the comments. I'd appreciate any sort of feedback as to how you think certain things work now, especially if something was a little less clear. I'm especially interested about how you would adjudicate the Conjure Celestial spell, or spells similar to Moonbeam, where it can be moved across the battlefield and it also now deals damage when it enters a creature's space. Does it continue to exist as it moves across the battlefield and hits every creature along the way? And again, I'm maybe a little more interested about how you think it works based on the rules as they're written. And then you can also let me know how you would rule it based on your own opinion and how it would work at your table. But I think the way that it reads, at least, is that it would continue to exist because it says it just moves across the battlefield. It doesn't say that it reappears at another location within, whatever range it is. Definitely interested in to know your opinions on that one. I think it is very strong if you allow it to continue to exist because it basically becomes a line spell after that rather than like a targeted area of effect that you can move around. But I'd be interested to play with it, just kind of see how I feel and how I'd adjust the counters accordingly, knowing that there's going to be more potential damage going around. But again, this is all for this video. Let me know what you think down in those comments. And again, while you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you are a new viewer to this channel or a returning viewer who hasn't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider hitting that subscribe button. Again, we're so close to the 1,000 subscribers. It's very, very exciting. We have the 8th and 9th level spells coming up next. I release videos every Sunday and Wednesday, so you always have something to look forward to. I appreciate all your guys' time, and I'll see you in the next one.